Are you sure you're reading your life correctly? My name is Emily Parker. I'm 27, I live in Denver, and this is a story about a father and a daughter who, like a lot of fathers and daughters, stood an arm's length apart and called it normal. If you're new here and stories like this matter to you, I'd love for you to stick around, subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Today's story is titled, Dad Never Gave Me Birthday Gifts Until After His Death. I found 18 presents he saved for each year. Denver has a way of sharpening the light, especially in the morning. On the day I came home from my father's funeral, Colfax Avenue was so bright it felt like the sky had been scrubbed with ice. The Rockies sat off in their regal quiet, that familiar outline I had used as a compass since childhood. I carried a shoebox of condolence cards and a plastic container of potato salad someone insisted I take, and for a second, only a second, I thought about my 7th birthday. It was the first birthday I remember being old enough to measure. 7 is when you start counting on more than your fingers. You count on people. There was a cake my mother made with store frosting and sprinkles shaped like stars, 1 candle for each year and an extra because my grandmother said you always add a wish for the road ahead. I remember the sweetness on my teeth, the paper plates bending under the weight, the dog nosing my socks. I remember looking at my father's hands, grease under the nails, knuckles cracked from a shift at the parts warehouse, and thinking now he'll tell me to close my eyes, hold out my hands. But the moment slid by. There was no now, only a gentle pat on my head and his voice the way it always was. Happy birthday, Em. We'll do something special on Sunday. Maybe you had that sentence in your house, too. The one that is both promise and postponement, that lives on the lip of a weekend that never arrives. Sunday became a shape I could fit my hope into, and at 7, the shape still felt sturdy. I waited with a child's patience, then I learned a different kind. If love were a language, my father spoke in repairs. He fixed the humming refrigerator with a butter knife and a prayer. He straightened our crooked mailbox with a rubber mallet and a piece of scrap pine. He turned squeaks into silence, rattles into hush. The way he showed up was with a toolbox, and the way I wanted him to show up was with a ribbon. I don't think I knew how to say that back then, and even if I had the words, I'm not sure he had an ear for them. By 13, patience had a sharp edge. I was all elbows and eye rolls, the kind of girl who pretended she wasn't listening even when she was. My friends compared notes on gifts like war medals, a phone, a bike with shocks, a silver locket. I learned to keep my hands in my pockets on my birthday, so no one would see they were empty. On my 13th, my father came home late smelling like winter air and motor oil, cheeks raw from the wind. He hung a new smoke detector in the hallway and said, "We needed that." I pretended not to hear, went back to the TV where a studio audience clapped for somebody else's life. The detector blinked a little red light, steady as a heartbeat, like it wanted me to notice it was trying. Sometimes you decide something early, and the decision becomes a lens you refuse to take off. I decided my father didn't know how to love me because he didn't love me the way I'd asked. I wore that decision through high school and into college like a jacket too small that I refused to admit pinched me. When he drove 6 hours to replace an alternator in my first used car, I saw a mechanic. When he mowed Mrs. Bradley's lawn after her hip surgery, I saw an errand. When he skipped a company picnic to pick me up from a flat tire in a grocery parking lot, I told myself it was just because he didn't want me to call a stranger. I wrote all the misinterpretations down in a ledger only I could see, a book of small grievances, an accounting of absences. Every year, another blank page where a birthday gift should have been. If you think you're immune to that kind of accounting, ask yourself this. When's the last time you tallied someone else's shortcomings like you were keeping score? We all do it, silently, with a seriousness that would make an auditor proud. You might have a mother who isn't a hugger, a friend who is always late, a partner who will never remember the anniversary of your first coffee. The book in your head is thick, and every day you thumb the edges of it, feeling the weight, telling yourself it proves the thing you've wanted to believe all along, that your disappointment is not only justified but ordained. My father's name was Daniel, but most people called him Dan. He worked with things you could hold and fix. He wasn't much for talking. When he did speak, it came out like he was testing the floorboards. Careful steps, hesitations where a more confident man would stride. He laughed at old sitcoms, the doctor office waiting room kind. He preferred practical shoes. He kept screws in baby food jars, sorted by size. His wallet was always in the top drawer of the dresser, next to a roll of quarters for the laundromat that we never went to but he kept anyway, as if someday the washer would die and leave us unprepared. People like him are always preparing for something they'll never explain. He died in early March. The kind of March that pretends it's already spring until a wind slides down from the hills and reminds you Colorado has its own calendar. It was a Saturday, and I was at a brunch where the mimosas were more orange juice than champagne, and someone was talking about the right age to start Botox. My phone buzzed on the table, a number I didn't recognize, the kind you let go to voicemail. It buzzed again, a text this time. "This is Pastor Lee. Please call." The words that change your life never arrive with their own music. They sit there plain as a grocery list. You could ignore them. You could press the lock button. You could look up and nod like you've been following the conversation about foreheads the whole time. But then you pick up, and the world you've learned so carefully how to measure goes unsized. At the funeral, the church was fuller than I expected. Pastor Lee is a short man with a voice like a warm scarf, and when he asked if anyone wanted to say something, I braced myself for the bare minimum. I thought of the ledger. I thought of all the blank birthday pages, but people stood. A woman from down the street with a yellow scarf said, "Dan changed my tire in the rain when my husband was deployed." A man I didn't recognize said, "He came by my house to check my furnace when he heard the carbon monoxide alarm on his scanner." A teenage boy, the kind with a shy smile, said, "He taught me how to sharpen a knife for the soup kitchen." They spoke the way you talk about a bridge you cross every day without noticing until one morning it's gone. I listened from the front pew and felt my jaw tighten. Grief has more than one thread. There was sadness, yes, but braided into it was something less gracious. It sounded like a question with a rough edge. Where were these stories when I needed them? Where were they on my 7th birthday, on my 13th, on my 19th when I moved into a dorm that smelled like microwave popcorn and missed my mother so badly I slept with an old sweatshirt? Where was this chorus then? After the service, a woman with a coat that looked too thin for the air came up to me. She had the kind of kind eyes you think only exist in fiction. "Your father," she said, "was a good man." People say that at funerals. It's one of the few scripts we share. But she added, "He kept things." She seemed to reconsider. "He kept them safe." I nodded like I knew what she meant. I didn't. Back at the house, casseroles multiplied on the counter the way they do when a person leaves. There were scalloped potatoes in a Pyrex with a chip on the edge, green beans floating in a cream we never ate when he was alive, rolls in a paper bag with a Sharpie label. Parker. People moved through the kitchen like they were trying to be helpful for a living. Someone asked me where the good plates were, and I wanted to say there were no good plates, only the ones we'd always used. Grief can make you particular about everything that never mattered. The house itself held the smell of my father, laundry detergent, and a faint metal warmth from the garage. In the hallway, the smoke detector blinked its steady red eye, like a lighthouse that would keep flashing even if the shore it warned you about had crumbled. His boots were by the mat. The laces had that white dust that looks like salt, but is probably just the memory of a road. I walked into my old room, the one with posters taken down but the tape marks still shaped like corners. The closet smelled like cedar because he once read cedar kept moths away and then declared our family a cedar family. On the top shelf was a shoebox I'd filled with high school things I had decided were essential. A dried corsage, the stub from a Rockies game, a letter I never sent. I sat on the floor and read the letter. It was to a boy named Matt, earnest words in earnest handwriting. I folded it back up and put it away. People always talk about the big change at the moment of death, but what you feel most are the small continuities. The way your hand still knows where to reach for the dresser handle. The way you still look for the porch light, even though nobody will be there to turn it on for you. When someone dies, you start noticing the places where you've been stingy. I thought about the last conversation I had with my father in the hospital, the way the machines hummed like an aquarium. He said, "I'm sorry about the birthday last year." The way he said it, you could tell he meant more than one. I said what people say when they can't let themselves open the door. "It's fine, Dad." Fine is such a small word for a room that size. He tried again. "I've been meaning to." Then the nurse came in to check the lines, and the sentence wandered off into the air. Meaning to is the most human construction we've invented. It's a future tense that never learns to walk. We put so much into meaning to call, meaning to set aside a weekend, meaning to say I'm sorry. If I could go back to that room, I would take my father's meaning to in both hands and hold it still until the rest of the sentence showed up. I would ask him, "What were you meaning to?" Not because I needed a present, because I needed a language. But that's for later. That's for the part of the story where we start to look more carefully at the floorboards and find there is a hidden staircase. For now, I want you to understand the scale of the absence and the size of the ledger I carried. For now, I want you to stand with me in a kitchen full of other people's casseroles. Under a ceiling my father painted twice by himself on a weekend I spent at a friend's lake house, with the smoke detector keeping time. I want you to feel the weight of a shoebox of sympathy cards that all sound like they were written by the same thoughtful stranger. If you've ever felt misunderstood by someone who loved you, you know the ache. It's not the pain of being unloved. It's the pain of being loved in a dialect you never bothered to learn. We tell ourselves the dialect is wrong. We tell ourselves we have the right to a different language. Maybe we do, but in the quiet after a funeral, with the light so clean it makes the dust honest, you start to wonder which stubbornness you want to keep. A day after the service, I went for a walk. The sidewalks in our neighborhood buckle a little because of tree roots. The air tasted like snow that had changed its mind. A kid shot hoops in a driveway with a net that had seen better summers. Somewhere a dog barked the way dogs bark at things you can't see. I passed the hardware store where my father knew every aisle, every bin of fasteners, every face. Mr. Jensen, who had worked there since I had baby teeth, caught my eye through the glass and held up a hand in a slow, awkward wave. I waved back. Denver felt like a place where the stories were stacked, waiting. When I got home, a neighbor had left a sheet pan of brownies with a note, "For sweet." It made me smile in spite of myself, for sweet. As if sweetness were a thing you could assign and deliver. I thought about the ledger. I thought about all the places I had written, not given. Then I thought about our porch light again, about how my father had once rigged it so it would flick on 10 minutes before I usually got home. "So you won't stumble," he'd said. I had rolled my eyes then. Teenagers are Olympic-level eye rollers. But standing in the doorway with a pan of brownies I hadn't asked for, I could almost admit that a porch light is a kind of gift. You might be expecting me to tell you that in that moment I forgave my father. That grief made me generous. That isn't how it works. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, is a drip, not a flood. It's a faucet you open a quarter turn and stand beside, waiting. Still, something shifted. I didn't know what it was yet. I only knew the ledger felt heavier than it had to be, like I had been the one adding weight to it all these years. That night I slept in my old room. The radiator knocked like a polite ghost. I dreamed I was 7 again, sitting at the kitchen table waiting for the now that never came. In the dream, my father set a toolbox on the table and opened it. Inside, there was tissue paper. Honestly, tissue paper where the sockets should have been. He reached in and pulled out a bow, the cheap kind you peel and stick. He stuck it to his own shirt and smiled like he was sorry and proud in the same breath. Then the dog barked in the hallway, the real hallway, and I woke up with my heart beating just a little too fast for a house this quiet. Morning came like it always does, stubborn, ordinary. I made coffee in the chipped mug I used to hate because it was brown and felt like it belonged to a person with fewer dreams. I sat at the kitchen table with the little red light of the smoke detector watching me blink for blink. The house was full of boxes we hadn't touched yet. Life after a death becomes a series of boxes. Some you open, some you pretend you will, some you never do. On the counter was a list in my father's careful printing. Call Jensen hinges, pick up filter, check attic. Even his to-do list was a repair. If love is a language, maybe it is also a list. Maybe it is a string of small, useful verbs. Call, pick up, check. Maybe it is the light that comes on because someone said it that way. Maybe it is a line of quarters in a drawer for a day that might not come. Maybe it is a smoke detector with a patient little eye, keeping watch over a hallway where a daughter has learned to count. This is the part where I tell you I wasn't ready for what I would find when I finally climbed the attic stairs. But that's not today. Today is simply the beginning, the measuring and the misreading, the way a daughter can live under the same roof as a father and not know the shape of his sentences. If you've been there, you know the ache in your throat when you say it's fine and the deeper ache when you realize you meant please try again. Are you sure you're reading your life correctly? I wasn't. Not yet. But the house had a way of sending me messages in the language my father spoke, and even I, stubborn as I was, would learn to listen. Stay with me. There are boxes to open and a few old stories that need the light. I have always believed that the way you learn to measure love in childhood becomes the ruler you carry for life. Some people grow up with rulers made of hugs and kisses, each inch marked by I love you. Others measure by shared meals, laughter, or rituals that repeat until they feel carved in stone. My ruler, the one I held against my father, was made of gifts. And year after year, the ruler kept coming up short. You might ask, why gifts? Why did I, of all the ways to ask for love, settle on presents wrapped in paper and bows? The truth is, I'm not sure. Maybe it was because my best friend, Kate, always showed off her gifts at school. Roller skates with pink wheels, glitter pens, a charm bracelet that jingled with each step. Maybe it was because television drilled into us that birthdays were parades of presents, the way sitcom families laughed around a mountain of boxes. Or maybe it was because my mother, gone too soon, had whispered once on my 4th birthday that my father would bring me something special. He didn't, and a child remembers a promise more sharply than an adult ever will. The absence of gifts grew into something larger than paper and ribbons. It became a shorthand for absence itself. Every missed birthday became a missing page in a story I thought my father refused to write. I wanted to believe he simply forgot, but the truth I convinced myself of was worse, that he didn't see me, that I wasn't worth the trouble of wrapping. When I was 9, I asked him point blank why he never gave me presents. I remember the way the evening sun hit his face, weary from another double shift. He was sitting at the kitchen table, eating the last of a sandwich that looked like it had been made in haste. 2 pieces of bread, a thin slice of ham, mustard bleeding at the edges. "Dad," I said, "why don't you ever get me gifts?" He looked up, startled, as if I'd asked him why the sky was blue. Then he chewed, swallowed, and shrugged. "I give you what you need, Em, that's what matters." I remember how my cheeks burned. Need. What a terrible, narrow word. Children don't want what they need, they want what makes them feel chosen. At 9 years old, I didn't care about socks that fit or food on the table or a roof that didn't leak. I wanted proof. I wanted to hold love in my hands, unwrap it, hear the crinkle of paper as if it were whispering my worth. That single sentence, "I give you what you need," became the anchor of my resentment. Each time my birthday rolled around and the day ended without a wrapped box, I returned to that line, tasting its bitterness again. He didn't understand, I told myself. He didn't care to understand. And as children do, I hardened the story until it became immovable truth. By middle school, the gap between us was a canyon. My classmates compared gadgets and games, and I sat silent, cheeks hot with shame. When I was 12, a girl named Hannah invited me to her birthday sleepover. She had balloons in every corner, a cake shaped like a castle, and enough gifts piled on the dining room table to look like a toy store had exploded. I remember sneaking into the bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror and whispering, "See, this is what love looks like." When I got home, Dad asked if I had fun. I shrugged, went to my room, and shut the door. I didn't tell him about the castle cake, the mountains of gifts, the way Hannah's dad came out in the middle of the party to say, "Sweetheart, we love you so much." Why would I? I already knew what my father would say. "I give you what you need." In high school, silence became our second language. He drove me to practice, to debate club, to part-time jobs, and we sat in the car like two strangers forced into the same rideshare. He would ask small questions. "How was school? Do you have homework?" And I would answer in monosyllables, eyes on my phone or out the window. Sometimes I caught him glancing at me, like he wanted to say more, but then he'd clear his throat and tap the steering wheel instead. On my 16th birthday, Kate got a car from her parents, a shiny used Honda Civic with a red bow on top. I told myself I wasn't jealous, but when Dad gave me an envelope with $20 inside, I laughed bitterly. He looked at me confused. "Gas money," he said, as if gas money was a gift, as if it was a love letter. We had our first real fight that night. I told him he didn't know how to be a father. He told me I didn't understand how hard he worked. I slammed my door. He went to the garage, the place he always retreated to when words ran out. If I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of his tools that night, the ratchet clicking, the clank of a wrench against concrete. It was the sound of a man repairing something broken, but not the thing that needed fixing most. College only deepened the distance. I left Denver with relief, like a prisoner given parole. I called home out of obligation, not longing. When he asked if I needed money, I said no even when I did. When he asked about my classes, I offered the shortest answers possible. I told myself I was building my own life, free from the shadow of his neglect. And yet, every birthday, I found myself watching the mail, hoping for a package that never came. The hope was a ghost that haunted me, even when I swore I had stopped believing. There was one exception. On my 21st birthday, he drove 6 hours to visit me at school. He didn't bring a gift. Instead, he fixed the broken lock on my apartment door and tightened the leaky faucet in the kitchen. He stood there with his hands on his hips, surveying the little apartment as if he had just secured a fortress. "Better," he said. I wanted to scream at him. Better, how could he think a faucet was a gift? But something in his eyes stopped me. For just a moment, I thought I saw pride, even love. Still, I turned away, too stubborn to let it in. Looking back, I realized that this was the root of everything, not the absence of gifts, but the absence of translation. He spoke love in repairs and provisions. I listened only for ribbons and bows. Two people, two languages, both waiting for the other to learn. At the time, though, I couldn't see it. All I saw was the ledger of absence, the long list of not given. I carried it like a badge, proof of my father's failure, and it was this ledger that I carried into adulthood, even into the week of his funeral. I didn't know then that in the attic above his room, sealed away in a box I had never noticed, lay 18 gifts waiting, 18 pieces of evidence that my story about him was only half true. But before that revelation, before the attic opened its quiet mouth, there was only the ache of years measured in missing presence. And that ache is what I want you to sit with for now, the ache of being misunderstood by someone who loved you, the ache of speaking one language and hearing another in return. It's the ache that shapes us more than we admit, because the truth is, every one of us is carrying some version of that ledger. The question is whether we're willing to look again at the entries, to ask if maybe we've been reading them wrong all along. The attic stairs groaned as if they, too, carried a weight too long ignored. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral, and the casseroles had stopped arriving, the phone calls had dwindled, the house had settled into its silence. Grief has a way of leaving you with chores, and one of those chores was cleaning out the rooms my father had occupied for decades. My aunt had suggested I wait, that it might be too soon, but I couldn't bear walking past closed doors any longer. The attic was never a place I explored as a child. It smelled of cedar and dust, a dry perfume of time itself. My father had always kept it locked, insisting it was full of old insulation and things not worth a child's curiosity. But grief makes you curious. It makes you hunt for scraps, for anything that might answer the questions you never dared to ask when you had the chance. So I pulled the cord that released the ladder, climbed into the dim, and let the smell of old wood wrap around me like a cloak. Cardboard boxes lined the beams, each labeled in my father's neat printing: Christmas lights, tax records, winter coats. He was a man who put order into everything, even what nobody else would see. I brushed past cobwebs, my flashlight cutting narrow cones into the darkness, and then my eye caught something strange. It was a wooden chest, not cardboard, pushed into the farthest corner. Unlike the other boxes, it had no label. Dust lay thick upon it, the kind that comes only from years of undisturbed keeping. My heart thudded. Something in me knew before I even bent down that this chest carried weight. Not physical weight, the emotional kind that presses on you before the lid ever opens. I pulled it into the light and ran my fingers over the grain of the wood. The lock was simple, a clasp that had long since lost its key. But years in Denver's dry air had left it brittle. I pried with a screwdriver until the hinge gave, and when the lid creaked open, my breath stopped. Inside were packages, 18 of them, each one wrapped in paper that had yellowed at the edges, tied with twine or ribbon, some crinkled as if moved and rewrapped over the years. On the top of each was a note, written in my father's familiar, careful hand: for Emily, age 1, for Emily, age 2, for Emily, age 3, and so on all the way until age 18. I sat back on my heels, the dust swirling in the beam of my flashlight like tiny spirits, and I covered my mouth. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I thought my heart might break open in the attic. My father, my quiet, stubborn, giftless father, had kept them all. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't neglected. He had saved them for me. The tears came in waves, silent at first, then shaking sobs that echoed against the rafters. I clutched the nearest package, the one labeled for Emily, age 1, and I held it to my chest like a child clutches a doll. The paper was fragile, nearly crumbling, but I didn't care. I wanted to press it against me until I could feel my father's hands again, the ones that had wrapped it all those years ago. I sat there a long time, the chest open before me, the packages stacked like a staircase into the years we had lost. My mind spun with questions. Why hadn't he given them to me? What had stopped him each year? Did he plan to give them to me when I turned 18? When I got married? When I had children of my own? Or had he been waiting for a courage he never found? Grief, when mixed with revelation, becomes a storm. I felt anger clawing through the sadness, anger that he had kept them hidden, that he had let me believe all those years that he didn't care. But under the anger, deeper still, was awe. Awe at the persistence, at the devotion it must have taken to choose, to wrap, to label, to save for nearly 2 decades. A man who fixed things with wrenches had also saved things with ribbons. Finally, I tore the paper from the first gift. My hands shook, not from impatience but from reverence. Inside was a rattle, the kind babies shake with delight. It was simple, wooden, worn by time, but still intact. Tucked beside it was a note. Your mother said you loved the sound of bells. I wanted you to have one of your own. The sob that left my chest then was almost animal. He had remembered. He had seen me, even at 1 year old, and he had written it down, as if to prove to his future daughter, grown, doubtful, skeptical, that he had loved her from the beginning. I opened the second. A tiny pair of mittens, no bigger than my palm, knit in pale blue yarn. The note, your hands were always cold. I wanted to keep them warm. The third, a children's book, Good Night Moon, edges frayed, the inside cover signed, Read this with me someday. Each gift was like a candle flickering in the darkness of my memories, illuminating corners I thought were empty. He had chosen with care, with thought, with a tenderness I had refused to believe him capable of. I didn't open them all at once. I couldn't. The weight of each was too heavy, the ache too raw. I carried the chest down from the attic and set it in my old room, where the posters had left their tape marks, and I sat on the floor surrounded by 18 wrapped proofs of love. That night I opened 4, then forced myself to stop. Each one carried me into a different year, a parallel childhood where I had known, if only I had been allowed to see. At 16, there was a small silver locket. The note read, For when you fall in love someday, I hope he sees you the way I do. At 18, the final gift, a leather-bound journal, empty pages waiting. Inside the cover, in his careful hand, Write your own story, Emily, but don't forget mine. I pressed my forehead to the journal and wept until the pages blurred with my tears. All those years I had written in my invisible ledger, marking absence, tallying neglect. And all along, in an attic above my head, another ledger had been waiting, one written in gifts, in notes, in the language I had always begged for. I wish I could tell you that the discovery instantly erased the years of distance, that forgiveness flowed through me like a flood. But the truth is messier. Love and regret are threads twisted together. I was grateful, yes, but I was also furious at the silence. Why hadn't he shown me? Why had he let me ache for so long? The answer, I think, lies in the way he lived. My father loved in preparation, not presentation. He built for tomorrow, even if it meant leaving today empty-handed. And yet, sitting on the floor with his gifts around me, I felt something loosen. The ledger in my mind began to crumble. For the first time, I allowed the possibility that I had been wrong. That love had been there all along, speaking in a dialect of patience and saving, a language I hadn't bothered to learn. The night stretched long. I lay awake with the journal on my chest, the unopened packages at my side. I thought of the years ahead, the birthdays to come without him, and I realized something I had never admitted before. The gifts weren't for the birthdays. They were for the aftermath, for this moment, for the silence of a daughter left behind, when the man who loved her could no longer explain himself. And in that silence, I heard him at last. The attic stairs groaned like they were protesting my weight, but really, I think they were protesting the years. They had carried only one person for decades, my father. His boots, steady and patient, had left their marks in the wood, faint indentations that no one else would notice. I climbed slowly, half afraid of what I might find, half afraid of finding nothing at all. The attic smelled the way old memories do. Dry, faintly sweet, like paper that has absorbed too many seasons. I swept the beam of my flashlight across boxes lined with my father's familiar handwriting. Christmas lights, 1998. Tax returns, 2002-2009. Camping gear. All neat, all carefully labeled because that was who he was. He might have been silent with words, but he was loud with order. And then, in the farthest corner, a shape out of place. A wooden chest, darker than the boxes around it, squat and silent as if it were guarding something. It had no label. That alone made it suspicious. My father labeled everything, even coffee cans in the garage had masking tape with nails, 1 inch, or washers mixed. But here, nothing, just dust. The lid gave reluctantly under the screwdriver. The sound echoed in the beams, a metallic snap followed by a long sigh of wood. I lifted it, expecting perhaps old tools or photo albums my father had hidden away. What I saw instead hollowed the air from my lungs. Packages, wrapped packages. 18 of them stacked carefully, not haphazard like clutter but intentional, tender. Each one carried a label written in that careful printing I'd seen on grocery lists my whole life. For Emily, age 1. For Emily, age 2. And on until for Emily, age 18. My knees gave way and I sat hard on the attic floor. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight like tiny ghosts. My throat closed. I covered my mouth, as if to hold back something raw and feral that wanted to escape. All those years, those birthdays I had measured like missing rungs in a ladder were here. Not missing, not forgotten, waiting. I reached trembling for the first one, the smallest, wrapped in paper that had yellowed with age, edges brittle. My fingers traced the ink for Emily, age 1. The handwriting was young then too, less steady than the later ones. I pressed it against my chest before daring to open it. The paper crinkled, soft from time. Inside was a wooden rattle, smooth, the kind you find at craft fairs. Tucked with it was a scrap of lined paper. Your mother said you loved the sound of bells. I wanted you to have one of your own. The sob ripped out of me before I could stop it. He had noticed. He had remembered. He had loved me in the language I had demanded, but he had hidden the words away. The second package was a pair of baby mittens, knit in pale blue yarn, stitches uneven. I held them against my palm. The note read, "Your hands were always cold. I wanted them to stay warm." The third, "Good night, moon," frayed edges, a little inscription, "Read this with me someday." I closed the book quickly because the ache was unbearable. Someday had never come. I didn't open them all at once. It felt like drinking grief straight from the bottle. You can't survive it in gulps. But curiosity tugged me, relentless. I pulled out the one labeled for Emily, age 7. That year, I remembered waiting for a gift that never came, remembered watching other kids unwrap dolls and games. The paper here tore reluctantly, and inside I found a jump rope. Red handles, plastic cord coiled neatly. The note, "You love skipping in the driveway. I thought you'd like your own." The memory hit me like a stone. I had borrowed the neighbor girl's jump rope that summer, begged Dad for one of my own. When he said we couldn't, I had assumed it was money, or worse, disinterest. And yet, here it was. He had bought it, wrapped it, saved it, for a day that never arrived. By the time I reached the gift marked age 13, I was shaking. That birthday had burned itself into me as one of the worst. My friends compared their presents, phones, charm bracelets, trips, and I had nothing. Dad had come home late that night, weary, and installed a smoke detector in the hallway. I had rolled my eyes, angry, embarrassed, certain he had given me nothing again. But here, in my lap, was a small box wrapped in faded paper. Inside, a necklace, not expensive but delicate, a silver chain with a tiny heart pendant. The note said, "You're a teenager now. I thought maybe you'd want something just yours. I'm sorry if I chose wrong." The sobbing returned, harsher this time. I remembered looking at his weary face that night, calling him careless, useless. And yet he had chosen this for me, apologized in advance for not knowing my taste, and saved it away. My cruelty met his silence. My ledger of neglect had been a mirror turned the wrong way. I lost track of time. The attic window filtered thin daylight that shifted from gold to gray. The packages stacked around me like a timeline of hidden devotion. Each note carried a sliver of him, his voice, his observation, his attempt at tenderness he never could deliver in person. At 16, there was the silver locket. The note, "For when you fall in love someday, I hope he sees you the way I do." My chest tightened so hard I thought I might break. At 18, the last, a leather journal unmarked waiting. Inside the cover, his handwriting, "Write your own story, Emily, but don't forget mine." I clutched it like a lifeline. His story, so quiet, so buried, was spilling into mine. Grief is never one color. It is a storm of contradictions, rage and reverence, guilt and gratitude, all colliding. I wanted to scream at him for hiding these. I wanted to hug him for saving them. I wanted to go back and shake my teenage self until she looked harder, listened better. But time doesn't bend. All it gives you are boxes in an attic and the choice of how to open them. That night, I carried the chest downstairs. My old room became an altar, packages spread around me like relics. I lay on the floor with the journal on my chest, tears soaking the leather, and I realized the cruelest truth of all. He had prepared this for after. Not for the birthdays, not for the moments I wanted, but for the silence when he would no longer be there to explain. And in that silence, I heard him clearer than I ever had when he was alive. The box sat at the foot of my bed for days, like a guest I didn't know how to talk to. Every morning, when the sunlight crept across the floorboards and brushed against it, I felt the weight of a conversation waiting. I had opened some of the gifts that first night, enough to leave me trembling, but the rest I couldn't yet touch. They seemed to glow in their silence, each one asking a question I wasn't ready to answer. What would I do with them? What did they mean now that he was gone? I found myself pacing the house as if it could tell me. The living room smelled faintly of cedar polish, a habit of his, though I had never once seen him polishing anything. The kitchen still held his coffee mug, chipped on the rim, sitting by the sink as if waiting for a refill. I even caught myself calling out once, absent-mindedly, "Dad," as though he might answer from the garage with his usual, "In here." The silence that followed was its own kind of cruelty. At night, the dreams came. In one, I was 7 again, sitting at the kitchen table waiting for him to place a wrapped box in front of me. Instead, he slid a toolbox across the table, but when I opened it, it wasn't filled with tools. It was filled with the gifts from the attic, each one glowing softly like lanterns. I tried to pick them up, but they dissolved into dust, and my father's voice said only, "I meant to." I woke with the sheets tangled around me and tears drying on my cheeks. The first time I tried to tell someone, it came out clumsy. Kate, my childhood friend, called to check on me. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice softened by distance, the way people speak when they know the truth is heavy. "I found something," I said, my throat tightened. He left me gifts, 18 of them, for every year until I turned 18. There was a pause. "He did?" she asked carefully. "Yes, they were in the attic, all wrapped with notes." I expected her to say how beautiful, how touching, how miraculous it was. But what she said was, "That must be hard." It startled me, hard, but then I understood it was both. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also cruel in its own way. Proof of love hidden until too late. A gesture so large it could almost crush you beneath it. After that call, I stopped trying to explain. How could I? Love hidden in an attic is not a story people are trained to understand. Instead, I began to open the gifts slowly, one by one, as though pacing myself through grief. On a gray afternoon, I unwrapped age 5. Inside was a set of crayons, still sharp, still smelling faintly of wax, the kind that stains your fingers. The note, "You love drawing rainbows on scrap paper. I wanted you to have your own colors." I held them in my hands and remembered pressing crayons so hard against construction paper that the wax crumbled, leaving marks too thick to erase. I remembered showing my father a picture once, two stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun, and asking if he liked it. He had nodded, distracted, wiping grease from his palms with a rag. "That's good, Em." I had sulked, thinking he hadn't even looked. But this box told me otherwise. He had seen me. He had remembered. He had bought the crayons. He just never handed them over. The contradiction hollowed me out. I sat there on the floor, holding those crayons, and whispered into the empty room, "Why didn't you give them to me?" No answer came. I began writing in the journal, the one marked for age 18. My father had left its pages blank, but I couldn't leave them that way. I wrote down each gift as I opened it, described it, copied his note word for word, and then added my response. Sometimes it was gratitude, sometimes fury, sometimes just a raw plea into the void. "You could have changed everything with this. Why didn't you?" Other times, softer, "Thank you. I didn't know you saw me. I wish I had known." The journal became my conversation with him. A conversation years too late, but still necessary. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains, I carried the locket from age 16 into the kitchen. I turned it over in my hand, felt its cool weight, then opened it. Inside was space for 2 small photographs, but it was empty. A note had been tucked with it, for when you fall in love someday. I pressed the locket to my chest and thought about the boy I had dated in college, the one I had never introduced to my father because I didn't think he'd care. What if I had shown him? Would he have nodded approval, said something fatherly? Or would he have remained silent, the way he always did, his love tucked into gifts never given? The questions never stopped. They filled my days until I could hardly eat. Each gift felt like a revelation and a wound at once. At age 10, there was a paperback copy of Charlotte's Web. His note read, "Your teacher said you love reading. This was my favorite when I was your age. I remembered begging him once to read with me, how he had said he was too tired and how I had gone to bed angry. Now I saw he had tried in his own way to pass the torch." At age 12, a baseball glove. The note, "You said once you wanted to play catch. I thought we might try together." My throat closed. That summer, I had asked him to play with me. He had said he was busy. I had stomped away, convinced he didn't care. But the glove had been here all along, waiting for a game that never came. The hardest gift was age 15. A cassette tape labeled simply, "Songs you liked on the radio." The note, "I recorded these when I heard you humming. Thought you might like to keep them." My vision blurred. My father, the man who never spoke much, had listened so carefully he had taped songs for me. I pictured him sitting by the radio, pressing record when he recognized a tune, waiting through commercials, patient. I had no idea. Every gift was like that. A bridge built across a canyon I had assumed was impassable. And every time I crossed, I felt both joy and sorrow. Joy at being loved, sorrow that I had not known until now. One night, overwhelmed, I carried the whole chest into the living room and set it in front of the fireplace. I lit a fire, though spring was already softening the nights, and sat on the rug with the gifts spread around me. It looked almost like Christmas morning, except the giver was gone. I imagined him there, sitting in his armchair, nodding, watching me unwrap each one. Would he have smiled? Would he have explained? Or would he, as always, have said little, letting the gifts speak for him? That night I made a decision. The gifts could not stay locked in that chest forever. They were not just relics of what could have been, they were lessons of what still could be. I would not let them rot in silence the way he had. I would use them. I would live them. The next morning, I wore the silver locket, not because I had anyone to put inside yet, but because I wanted his words close. I hope he sees you the way I do. I put the crayons on my desk and began sketching again for the first time in years, clumsy lines that slowly found their way. I even took the baseball glove outside, threw a ball against the garage wall until my arm ached, tears running down my face as I imagined him on the other side, catching, tossing back. In these small acts, I began to understand what the gifts meant. They weren't just apologies for missed birthdays, they were blueprints, invitations. They were his way of saying, this is how I saw you, this is what I wished for you, this is who I believed you were. And as I followed those invitations, something inside me shifted. The ledger I had kept, the long record of his failures, began to dissolve. Not erased, because pain leaves its mark, but rewritten, reframed. The story was not of a father who didn't love. It was of a father who didn't know how to show it in time. Forgiveness is never sudden. It is not lightning, it is dawn, slow, inch by inch, warming the edges of the sky. In those weeks, surrounded by his silent gifts, I felt the first light seep in. I was angry still, yes, but I was also grateful, and for the first time the gratitude outweighed the anger. One evening, journal open on my lap, I wrote, "Dad, I forgive you, not because you asked, but because I need to, because I see now that you loved me, even if you hid it away. And I don't want to carry the weight of misunderstanding anymore." The page blurred as my tears fell. But when I closed the journal, I felt lighter than I had in years. The box at the foot of my bed no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a gift in itself, the final, greatest one. A conversation that had begun too late, but still miraculously begun. And that was enough to keep me going. The days after finding the gifts blurred into one another, but they also sharpened me in strange ways. Grief, I realized, is not only about missing someone, it's about learning who they were in the silence they left behind. And my father's silence was not empty at all. It was a chorus, waiting for me to hear it. It began at the grocery store. I had gone in for milk, wearing the locket he had saved for me at 16. I didn't expect anyone to notice, but at the checkout counter, Mrs. Hanley, who had lived down the street my entire childhood, leaned over and touched the chain lightly. "That belonged to your mother, didn't it?" she asked. "No," I said, startled. "Dad gave it to me, sort of." My voice faltered. "He left it for me." Her eyes softened. "That man, he had more tenderness than he ever showed. Do you know he fixed my porch steps one winter, wouldn't take a dime for it, said he didn't want me slipping." I shook my head. I had never known. My father never mentioned it, never asked me to help, never even hinted at his quiet errands. 2 days later, I went for a walk around the block, and Mr. Jenkins, the mailman who had retired years ago but still shuffled the neighborhood with his old blue cap, stopped me. "Your dad," he said, pointing his cane as if punctuating the words, "was the reason my furnace kept running the winter of '09. Came by twice a week, checked it himself. He saved us a fortune, saved our lives, probably. We never would have made it through the freeze." I stood there in the chill spring air, my hands shoved into my coat pockets, and realized how small my view of him had been. All my life, I had measured him only against what he gave me. I never thought to measure him against what he gave the world. The stories multiplied. It was as if, now that he was gone, the town decided to unlock its own attic of hidden gifts. People stopped me at the diner, at the post office, even once at the gas station while I filled my tank. Each one began the same. "Did you know your dad?" He had repaired a stranger's car in the middle of a snowstorm. He had mowed the lawn of the widow on Oak Street for 3 summers straight. He had driven a neighbor's kid to the hospital when no one else was around. He had donated money quietly, anonymously, to the high school band trip. Each story was like opening another package, but these were not labeled with my name. They belonged to everyone. And yet, they all circled back to me, because they revealed the man who had raised me, the man I had misunderstood. One afternoon, I sat in the pews of the small church, empty now except for the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Pastor Lee had agreed to meet me, though I wasn't sure why I had asked. I told him about the gifts, about the notes, about my confusion. He listened, nodding, hands folded in his lap. When I finished, he said, "Your father was a man of deeds, not words. Some people pray out loud, others pray with their hands. Dan prayed with his hands. But why keep it all from me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why let me think he didn't care?" Pastor Lee sighed. Sometimes people don't believe their love is enough. Sometimes they think saving it makes it bigger, more worthy. Your father was always saving money, supplies, time. Perhaps he thought he was saving love too for the day you needed it most. The words pierced me. The day you needed it most. And hadn't it been true? The gifts meant more now in my aching emptiness than they ever would have when I was a child tearing through paper. They were anchors in a storm. They were proof, not promise. I left the church with a heaviness that was also light, if such a thing is possible. That night, the doorbell rang. It was nearly dark, and I hesitated before opening it. On the porch stood a boy, maybe 16, hair falling into his eyes, holding a crumpled baseball cap. "You don't know me," he said quickly. "But your dad, he used to come by the community center. He taught me how to fix bikes. He said you used to ride everywhere when you were younger. He said his daughter was faster than the wind." My breath caught. Faster than the wind. I had said that once when I was 9, pedaling down the street, hair whipping behind me. I hadn't realized he'd remembered. The boy shuffled. "I just wanted to say thank you. He kept me out of trouble. I think he saved me." I watched him walk away into the night, his figure swallowed by streetlights, and my chest ached. My father had been saving people all along, quietly, invisibly, while I had been tallying his failures on my birthdays. I couldn't sleep. I sat in my room with the journal open, writing furiously, page after page. I wrote down every story I had heard, every kindness, every hidden deed. I wanted to build a new ledger, one not of absence but of abundance. For every year I thought he had given me nothing, I now had proof he had given the world something. The next morning, I gathered the courage to knock on neighbors' doors to ask, "Do you have a story about my father?" At first, they looked surprised, but then the stories poured out like water from a cracked jar. Mrs. Alvarez told me how he had shoveled her driveway every snowstorm without fail. Mr. Patel remembered how he had repaired a leaky roof at the corner store when the repairman never showed. A teacher from my elementary school recalled how he had quietly paid for a child's field trip who couldn't afford it. Each time, I nodded, sometimes cried, sometimes laughed through the tears. And each time, I felt my heart stretch wider. By the end of that week, I had filled half the journal. The blank pages my father had given me for my story were now his too, stitched together in ink and memory. It struck me then, maybe that was his plan. Maybe he had left me the gifts not only to see him differently, but to force me to seek out others to stitch his story through theirs. He had given me not just objects, but a community of witnesses. A map of love that had been all around me, unseen, waiting. One evening, I sat with Kate at the diner where we used to drink milkshakes after school. I told her some of the stories. She listened, eyes wide, and finally said, "Em, you realize your dad was kind of a hero, right?" I shook my head. "Not a hero, just someone who kept showing up." She smiled sadly. "Sometimes that's the biggest kind of hero." I thought about that all night, showing up. My father had shown up for everyone, neighbors, strangers, even kids who weren't his own. And somehow, in showing up for them, he had been showing up for me too, though I hadn't recognized it. That realization didn't erase the pain of the birthdays I'd cried through, the teenage years I'd felt invisible. But it reframed them. He hadn't been absent. He had been present in ways I hadn't learned to see. And slowly, with each story told, each note read, each memory rewritten, I began to understand that love is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, patient. Sometimes it is a smoke detector blinking in the hallway, a porch light set to turn on before you arrive, a stranger's furnace fixed on a freezing night. Sometimes it is 18 gifts wrapped in silence, waiting for the day a daughter will finally be ready to unwrap not just the paper, but the truth. The journal filled quickly. By the time spring deepened into early summer, its pages had become a patchwork of two lives, my father's and mine, woven together by objects, stories, and tears. Each entry was part confession, part gratitude, part vow. But writing wasn't enough anymore. Words filled pages, yes, but they didn't change the ache in my chest when I woke each morning to the silence of a house without him. One morning, I stood at the kitchen counter holding the baseball glove from age 12. I slipped it on my hand. The leather was stiff, the smell sharp and clean even after all these years. My fingers pressed against the grooves where his hands must have tested the fit before wrapping it. I walked outside, stood in the driveway, and began throwing a ball against the garage wall. The thunk, thunk, thunk echoed into the quiet street. At first, I felt foolish, a grown woman throwing a ball to no one. But then something shifted. The rhythm became a kind of conversation, the sound of catch without the partner. Each return of the ball was like an answer, and for the first time in years, I imagined him beside me. That was when I decided the gifts couldn't remain relics. They were meant to be lived, to be carried into the world, not locked in a chest or scribbled in a journal. My father had left me blueprints, not artifacts, so I made a plan. The first step was simple. I placed the crayons from age 5 on my desk. I hadn't drawn in years, not since high school art class when I had convinced myself I wasn't talented enough. But I took a piece of scrap paper, the kind he would have used for lists or sketches, and I began. My lines were crooked, my colors messy. But slowly, shapes formed. The outline of our old house, the smoke detector in the hallway, the locket resting on the table. The picture wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time, I thought maybe he would have framed it. The second step came harder. The cassette tape from age 15. I no longer had a player, but I found one in a thrift shop and slid the tape in. The songs were scratchy, static-filled, but recognizable. Old pop hits, country ballads, even a silly jingle from a cereal commercial. I listened, headphones pressed tight, and imagined him sitting by the radio, finger hovering over the record button, waiting for the exact moment the song began. He had listened to me hum, to me sing under my breath, and thought enough of it to capture them for me. So I hummed along now, out loud, in my kitchen, in my car, walking down the street. I let the songs stitch me back to a girl who had once felt unseen, and to a father who had been listening all along. The third step came from the stories my neighbors had told. The woman whose porch steps he fixed, the boy he taught to repair bikes, the widow whose lawn he mowed. My father's life had been one long chain of small, unheralded kindnesses, and if he had done that without recognition, why couldn't I? So I started, quietly, without announcing it. I raked leaves from Mrs. Hanley's yard without being asked. I carried groceries for Mr. Patel when I saw him struggling with bags. I signed up at the community center to help tutor kids in reading, remembering the copy of Charlotte's Web he had left me. The first time I walked in, the kids eyed me suspiciously, but then one boy smiled, and soon we were reading aloud, stumbling over words together, laughing at the spider who seemed wiser than any adult we knew. Each act felt like unwrapping another gift, not one my father had left, but one I could create. And with each act, the ache softened. Yet even as I found purpose, the anger lingered. Some nights, I still lay awake asking why he hadn't given me the gifts sooner, why he had let me carry the bitterness for so long. On those nights, I opened the journal and wrote letters I knew would never be answered. Dad, did you know how much I cried on my birthdays? Did you know how invisible I felt? Did you keep them hidden because you were afraid I wouldn't understand? Because you were afraid they weren't enough? The silence that followed was unbearable. But slowly, I realized that the silence itself was part of his answer. My father had always spoken in silence, in the quiet repair, in the unnoticed favor, in the unspoken word. Perhaps this, too, was his language. One evening, I decided to visit the garage. It had remained untouched since his death, a shrine of tools and jars and half-finished repairs. The smell of oil and dust hit me as soon as I opened the door. I flicked on the light, and the space came alive. Baby food jars filled with screws, coffee cans labeled in tape, hammers lined neatly on a pegboard. I had avoided this place because it felt too much like him. But now, standing there, I saw something different. This was his cathedral. This was where he had prayed with his hands. I pulled one of the jars from the shelf and held it up to the light. Inside were washers, all identical, gleaming faintly. The label read, "Washers 1/4 inch. Precision, order, care." And suddenly I saw the connection. My father had saved these small things because he believed they would be needed someday, just as he had saved the gifts. He hadn't trusted the world to hold things for him, so he held them himself. I placed the jar back carefully, reverently, and I whispered into the still air, "I see you now." That was the night I forgave him fully, not because the pain had vanished, but because I understood. He had done the best he could with the language he had, and it was enough. The weeks that followed became a quiet transformation. I wore the locket daily. I wrote in the journal each morning, not only to him, but to myself. I began drawing portraits of the neighbors who had told me their stories, giving them as small thank yous. And slowly, I felt something grow inside me, not just healing, but a calling. One Saturday, I gathered a group of neighborhood kids and taught them how to ride bikes. I used the same phrases I remembered him using with me. Don't look down, look ahead. Keep your balance. Trust yourself. When one little girl finally pedaled without wobbling, she beamed, and I felt my father's hand on my shoulder, invisible but sure. I realized then, the greatest way to honor his gifts was not to keep them, but to pass them on. So I began planning something bigger. A community project, maybe, in his name. A way to gather all the stories, all the kindnesses, and weave them together. A way to tell the world that love doesn't always arrive wrapped in paper. It arrives in the steady presence of someone who shows up, again and again, without applause. But even before that vision could take shape, I understood the truth in my bones. His gifts had done what he meant them to. They had saved me, not from poverty, not from danger, but from the blindness of misunderstanding. They had pulled me back from a life of bitterness, shown me a map to gratitude, and given me a language I had never learned until too late. And in learning it, I was no longer a daughter abandoned by silence. I was a daughter carried by love. I used to think love had to arrive with fanfare, that it had to be wrapped in bright paper, announced in bold words, placed in my hands where everyone could see. I thought if it wasn't visible, it wasn't real. For most of my life, that was the ruler I measured my father by, and by that measure he always came up short. But I was wrong. Now, months after his funeral, I see him everywhere. In the locket that rests against my chest each morning when I rise, in the crayons that sit on my desk, their wax slowly shrinking as I sketch pieces of the world I once ignored. In the baseball glove, stiff but loyal, that I used to toss a ball against the garage wall when I need to hear the sound of his voice in the rhythm of the returns. I see him in the neighbors' porches, in the lawns trimmed neatly though they never asked, in the stories whispered to me at the market about debts he never called in, favors he never advertised. I see him in the laughter of children at the community center as they read Charlotte's Web aloud with me, stumbling over words the way I once did. I see him in the small kindnesses that ripple outward when I try, even imperfectly, to follow the blueprint he left. His 18 gifts were never just presents. They were a map, a guide out of bitterness, a lantern for the dark places I carried inside. They taught me that love doesn't always show up in the language you expect. Sometimes it is hidden in rafters, sometimes in jars of washers, sometimes in the way a man fixes a furnace for a stranger in the dead of winter. I cannot change the years I spent angry. I cannot erase the birthdays I cried through or the nights I slammed doors, convinced I was unloved. But I can choose what I carry forward, and what I carry now is this. My father loved me, steadfast and stubborn, in a dialect I never learned until he was gone. And in learning it, I have been saved from the prison of misunderstanding. There is a truth I want to leave with you, the one that has taken me all these pages to learn. Love is not always loud. It is not always spoken or wrapped or timed the way you wish. Sometimes love is quiet. Sometimes it is saved, waiting. Sometimes it is revealed too late to be returned in kind. But even then, it is no less real. And if you are listening to this now, I ask you, look again at the people in your life. The father who never says, "I love you," but checks your tires before you drive. The mother who never gives speeches of pride, but cooks your favorite meal after a long day. The friend who shows up to help you move without being asked. They may not be speaking your language, but they are speaking love all the same. My father never gave me birthday gifts, not in the way I wanted. But after his death, I found 18 of them, each one a reminder that I was seen, cherished, remembered. And those gifts have changed me. They have taught me to look for the quiet gestures, the hidden sacrifices, the small mercies that weave a life together. I share this story because maybe, just maybe, you've been carrying a ledger like mine. Maybe you've been keeping score of absences, tallying disappointments, convinced they mean you are unloved. If so, I beg you, look again. Open the attic of your life. You may find, as I did, that love has been waiting there all along. And if my father could leave me one final note beyond those gifts, I think it would say this: do not waste your life waiting for love to arrive in the form you expect. Learn to see it where it already is. So I carry his journal. I write in it daily, adding my story to his, building a bridge between our silences. And every time I turn a page, I feel him close. Not gone, not really, just quiet. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I hope it reminds you to treasure the people around you, even when they love differently than you wish. May you find peace in your own family's hidden languages, and may you never have to wait until it's too late to see them. I wish you health, joy, and the kind of happiness that grows best in the soil of family. And if this story touched you, I would be grateful if you stayed with me for the next ones, simply by subscribing, so we can keep walking through these stories together. Because in the end, none of us wants to walk alone.